Vampire Survivors. Basically, a highly addictive drug, but distilled into video game form. If you don't know what it is, it's a game where the only action you do is walk around, and you have attacks that fire around you automatically. The game loop is extremely simple, but eventually, you basically reach this god mode status and destroy everything around you, and it activates your monkey brain neurons. Any game dev who's played this game has probably wanted to make their own version at some point, and I'm no different. But what's a little different is the platform I typically make games for. If you take a peek at my channel, for the last year I've been making games for this handheld console called the Playdate, and I was ready to try and take my game development to the next level. It was decided. I was going to recreate my own version of Vampire Survivors for the Playdate. Except, there's one small issue. This would be my biggest game yet, and I failed at something like this before. Last year, I tried making this game called Gladiator that was meant to be a cool combat-based roguelike. However, after putting out several devlogs, I realized I was completely out of my depth and had to drop the project. It honestly sucked. It felt like I was putting a promise out to the universe that I was going to do something, but was faced with the harsh reality that I wasn't good enough. This time though, I was determined to make it work. However, it wouldn't be easy. One thing I was especially worried about was how much art would be involved. It isn't exactly my strong suit, and there would be a lot of sprite and UI work to do. I started to feel the self-doubt that I felt before creeping in, but one day, I got a random DM. The message was from someone called Dave Hoffman, also known as davemakes. If you're part of the Playdate community, you might know them as the developer of the Season 1 game, Executive Golf DX, and they've also made another awesome game called Mixolumia, a fantastic developer and incredibly talented artist. I was already a fan of theirs, so when they asked to collab, I was super excited, and the seeds of doubt started to burn away in my mind.
Hi, my name's Dave. I made a game called Mixolumia and the Playdate Season 1 game, Executive Golf DX. A while back I got hooked on Squid God's videos, and while I was playing almost tennis on the train one day I thought, hey, I wonder if he'd want to collab on something. So I reached out and here we are.
We hopped on a call and started brainstorming some ideas. Here's what we came up with.
To help distinguish ourselves, we veered away from fantasy, paranormal, occult themes, and chose a sci-fi setting. We outlined a scenario where the player is remote controlling mining droids, sending them down into the depths of an alien planet to collect resources while fending off hostile subterranean creatures.
Of course, since the player has a crank on the side as an input device, the idea was for the crank to control the movement of the player. The maps for Vampire Survivors are super massive, and I imagined it'd be difficult to match that without having some performance issues on the Playdate. So I decided that we could go with a small map instead. To test it out, I put together this tile map in an external program and loaded it into the game. Next step was to get a basic character controller up and running, so I used this asset pack as some placeholder art and tested turning the character with a crank. With that working, I went straight to testing moving the character. But I ran into a weird situation. Usually I like adding some acceleration to character movement to make it feel more dynamic, but it made it so that switching directions became really sluggish. And it didn't really make much sense since you couldn't stop moving, so I ended up removing it and it started to feel really snappy. Next task was to make the camera follow the player, which was pretty simple to implement, but I was getting this weird jittery movement on the diagonals. A solution would be to smooth the camera movement, and luckily there's a handy function called lerp that smoothly interpolates between values, so I used that to fix my problem. Of course, there's nothing to do yet except walk around, so it was time to add some enemies. I added some temp art for the enemies, and at first it was looking okay, but there's something I forgot to account for that you have to consider when developing games for the Playdate that almost made us have to completely abandon the game idea entirely. You see, when you're coding a Playdate game, you usually test it on something called the simulator, which runs on your computer. That's so you can get a fast iteration loop with your changes, as uploading the game to the Playdate every time you make a change can be a hassle. This works fine in most cases because the functionality is pretty much identical between the simulator and the device. However, there's one massive thing that's different, which is performance. The simulator runs much faster than the actual device since it's using the CPU of your computer, while the Playdate has a considerably slower 168 MHz CPU. Dave and I were worried about the performance on device before we started, but we said screw it, let's just try to make this work. But check out how this current build is running. As you can see, the frames start dropping from the full 30 FPS even with just 2 enemies on the screen, which is insanely bad. Ideally, we'd be able to get somewhere around 90 enemies on the screen, and at this stage that would just turn into a PowerPoint presentation. Honestly, I wasn't sure if we'd be able to resolve this, but I wasn't ready to give up quite yet, so I started slowly hacking away at the problem. Here's what I did for the first pass. In Vampire Survivors, the enemies collide against each other so they're spaced out, but this was a huge performance drain since the collision checks are pretty expensive operations, especially with several enemies colliding together at once. There are probably some ways to work around it. for example only checking collisions once per pair, but I decided to remove the enemy collisions entirely to give myself more headroom to work with, and I deal with the consequences later. Next, for the enemy pathfinding, I was finding the angle between the enemy and the player and was using trick functions to get the direction the enemy should be going. But I realized I could be doing the same thing using square roots instead, which is a little faster of an operation. There ended up being a ton of micro optimizations like that in the code, half of which I don't even remember. The last thing I did in my first attempt to improve performance was to stagger the pathfinding for each enemy. Instead of calculating which direction each enemy should go every frame, you can split it up and only do the calculation every few frames, and then stagger the calculations for different groups of enemies to give more overhead for each frame. The enemy tracks the player less accurately, but the player can only move so much between each frame, so it ends up not being a big deal. As you can see on device, after those changes, there can now be way more enemies on screen, but we weren't quite out of the woods yet. Because of the staggered pathfinding, the enemies would settle into this weird ring pattern. Also, eventually they would all coalesce and overlap each other. We couldn't have that, but I was totally lost on what to do since it seemed like we still needed some sort of collision. However, after looking up some ways to optimize collisions, I came across what I hoped to be the magic bullet: quad trees. Well, not a tree made of quadriceps, but a way to have more performant collisions by segmenting enemies into quadrants that are recursively subdivided. This way, instead of checking every entity to see if you collided with them, you only need to check in the quadrant that you're in. I spent a couple days trying to implement quad trees, and you might notice while it seems a little better, it's not quite there yet. The reason was because I had to make a few changes to the algorithm since it was still pretty performance intensive. Since the enemies are constantly moving around, you also have to keep recalculating the quad tree to update their positions. I ended up staggering the collision detection like with the pathfinding, and also instead of true collisions, I just pushed the enemies away from each other. But all those sacrifices for performance made it so that it ended up just looking like crap. Around the same time, another developer in the Playdate community, Tim Hay, posted some clips of a Vampire Survivors demo that he was working on, and it was crazy. 100 enemies with full collisions working. And not only that, it was running at the max of 50 FPS instead of the 30 FPS that I was working in. How was he able to get that to work when I was lagging with just 2 enemies on screen? Well, first, he's smart. But also, there's currently 2 different programming languages that you can use for Playdate development. The first one is Lua, which is easier to work with and is the one I'm using, and the second one is C, which is a little more complex, but you can get much better performance with it. Except I had no idea how big the gap in performance was until I saw his clips. Honestly, I was just rethinking everything at this moment and wondering if we should just completely rewrite the project in C. The problem is though, I've been developing using Lua for the past year, and I was really comfortable in the environment, so switching to C would slow down the dev process a lot. However, with nothing else really left to lose, I just decided to try one last thing. The core problem was that the enemies were bunching up. But what if you could just make them move around randomly a little bit, and maybe they'll diffuse out, similar to how if you drop dye in water it spreads out. Getting a random direction would be really fast, so maybe it might work. I wrote a bit of code to just make them move around randomly most of the time, and occasionally move towards the player. And hey, it's not bad. It basically looks like how I handle the quad tree stuff, but with way less overhead. There are probably way better ways to do this, but honestly, I was just happy that I could keep moving forward. You can say that progress is better than perfection, and I was ready to move on to something more fun, like player abilities. A lot of the fun in Vampire Survivors comes from the weapons you unlock and upgrade, so the next focus was on that. I hopped onto a call with Dave, and we brainstormed some ideas together and came up with some options. The first one was this beam attack that shot a laser in the direction that you're facing. At the time, I was playing a lot of different indie games for market research. One of them is this Diablo-inspired game called Neophyte. In the game, you pick up spells and swap them to suit your playstyle. I like how there's more close-range melee attacks and ones that were long-range, so you can sort of create different builds. And the beam was meant to be a take on the melee weapon. The beam wasn't doing anything quite yet, so I made it so that it would actually collide with the enemies and damage them. However, when I tested it on device, it was looking a little too small, so I decided to bump up the sprite size to make it easier to see. This slice of cheese is only about the size of a post-it note, so the readability is something you have to consider a lot. Next weapon was a sideways attack called Shock Prod, similar to the whip from Vampire Survivors. The mashed together temporary art was really starting to build up at this point, but luckily, this is when Dave pulled through with some amazing sprites.
In this type of game, it can be easy to lose track of the player sprite in a sea of enemies and weapon effects. On the Playdate's tiny 1-bit screen, I knew clarity would be crucial. I thought of the droid as the single point of light in a dark space, and drew its sprite white with a black outline. I contrasted that with all the shadowy creatures coming out of the dark, and thought of them as being comprised of alien jelly, black with a white outline, coagulating around the piercing eye of some kind of power orb the player draws from to level up when it's destroyed. In a game where your main interaction is steering, it made sense to try and convey the direction the droid is facing pretty clearly, so I drew an 8-directional player sprite. This information was less important for enemies, so we went with the more economical single-direction flip. That meant we could make more enemies instead of wasting time animating slimes from all angles.
It was looking pretty slick in game, but when he bumped into enemies, nothing happened, so I needed to add a health bar. Here was the first pass in the top right corner, but it was impossible to keep track of at the same time as the player, so I moved it to right underneath the player. Currently, this was the only scene in the game, but Dave and I started to think about what we wanted the game loop to look like. We decided that the weapons would be called equipment, and you could select the starter equipment at the beginning of each run. Then, you would be dropped into a level and have to defeat a certain amount of enemies, and then be able to choose a different piece of equipment. We also decided there should be some upgrades that you can choose from that boost basic stats like health and movement speed. Here's what I ended up adding to the game to facilitate that. It might look a little bit silly to have this random placeholder art, but the concept of scenes doesn't exist by default in the Playdate SDK like it does in other game engines like Unity, so the placeholder and transitions represent some work I did on the back end to get it working. Next equipment I made was the first range attack called Pea Shooter that just fired a bunch of little pellets. Then, taking inspiration from the Garlic and Vampire Survivors, I added Static Field that continuously damaged nearby enemies. During this time, another game I was playing was Snake RX, and I thought it was interesting how they implemented their class system. In the game, the units you pick up belong to one of several classes that had different playstyles. Each class had their own synergies, and you can adapt your playstyle to your preferences by picking certain classes. I thought it might be cool to have an ability that leaned into the heavy tank playstyle, so I added Discharge, which stores up the damage that you've taken recently and deals it to nearby enemies. At the time, I thought it was a good idea. However, later on I realized I didn't implement nearly enough equipment to have that much variation for different playstyles, so it was eventually removed. The last equipment I implemented for now was Subterranean Rocket, which deals AoE damage at a distance in front of you, to add some variation to how you might move and aim yourself. At this point, Dave and I were having weekly calls to discuss different aspects of the game, and we got on the discussion of the map. You might have noticed that in the recent clips, the tile map was removed. One reason was because the tile map was actually causing some performance issues, but also it was a temporary fixture that we wanted to rethink. We didn't want to spend too much time on making custom maps, so Dave came up with the idea to have the map be a 3x3 grid and randomly place blocks around the map to just add a little bit of variation between levels. So I went back and implemented that into the game, and now every time you load into a level, it will have a different layout. We also discussed how we wanted to handle overall progression. Vampire Survivors has unlocks that you can use to buy gold, and since we have this whole mining thing going on, we decided on spawning things around the map that you can mine and get cores, which would be the currency that you can use to buy upgrades. That way you can get stronger between runs, Rogue Legacy style. I then went back to finish the last few pieces of equipment that we would have for the initial release. I wanted to have something where you spun in a circle, it would fire out a ring of projectiles. But I thought that maybe rewarding cranking quickly wouldn't be good for the health of the crank, so I decided to scrap that one. However, I noticed that with the projectiles, since it would despawn after hitting just one enemy, there was an opportunity to start implementing the upgrades and add one that would allow projectiles to pass through more enemies. So I added the piercing upgrade. I also added a bunch of other upgrades in the back end, like crit chance, health regen, more speed, and damage. Since I scrapped the last piece of equipment, I decided to turn it into radio waves that just fires a ring of projectiles periodically instead. And lastly, I added plasma cannon, which just shoots out a large chunky projectile. Around this time, Dave made some art for the walls that made it blend into the background, and also the ore, which looked amazing. They also sent over a mock-up for what the equipment select UI should be like, the first of many UI screens that needed to be implemented into the game. They imagined the background to have some streaks animating up, like you're falling deeper into the planet. The first pass was just taking the entire pattern and scrolling it, but it looked super static, so I tried to think of what to do next. The next idea was to make it ease in and out, but that was terrible. Then I landed on spawning each streak individually and giving them random positions and velocities. Now I was getting somewhere, so after I bumped up the number of streaks, it was looking slick. Dave also went through the effort of slicing up the UI into separate assets, so I thought it would be cool to animate them all in separately. After a bit of time, I got the UI falling in nicely using some easing functions and got the selection working. So when you select a piece of equipment, it adds into your inventory and loads you into a level. Speaking of stuff that falls down nicely, do you know about this block puzzler Mixolumia? Was that a smooth transition? Dave doesn't know I'm doing this, but I'm secretly advertising their game as a sponsor segment on this video because I think it's cool and we gotta support our indie devs out here. The game is a twist on falling block puzzlers, and it's got that ear-melting music and juicy visuals that'll get you playing over and over again. You can swap out the color palette and also choose between a bunch of different soundtracks. The soundtracks change the sound effects too, and they all harmonize with the music, so you get a totally different vibe for each one. You should definitely go check it out. It's available on Steam and itch.io, but also on the Nintendo Switch, which seems like the perfect platform for the game. Also, they live tweeted the creation of their game as they were making it, and the thread is amazing. That's how I first discovered Dave, and it's so incredible watching a game go from concept to final product in front of your eyes. You have to at least check that out. Now, back on the topic of the game, I just finished implementing the first UI, but at this point we've been working on the game for about a month and I was starting to feel a particular insidious feeling creep up again. You see, with the previous game, Gladiator, the part that made me quit was the feeling that there was too much content left to make and that I wouldn't ever be able to finish. It's kind of an overwhelming feeling, since at the start everything is exciting and you're making so much progress, and then you have to start working on UI and you regret everything. But luckily, I had some accountability through Dave, and also I decided that this time I would give myself a break. What kind of break, you ask? Well, what better way to take a break from making a game by making a completely different game? So I took a couple weeks to work on the King's Dungeon, which is a tiny Metroidvania. I covered the whole process of making that game in another devlog. I'm not really sure if it was the best idea to make an entirely new game to combat burnout, but it worked to get me excited about development on this game again, so it all panned out. Since I took some time to make my other game, Dave was hard at work making some more UI, so there was a lot of work backed up for me to get to. First was the scene between different levels. Here, you can choose an upgrade and also swap out the equipment that you have for a new one. We decided that the player could only have up to 3 different pieces of equipment at one time, partly for performance reasons and partly for balance. They've also sent over some awesome icons for all the different equipment types as well, so I dropped that into the game. Another thing to implement was the results screen that shows all your stats, equipment, and upgrades at the end of the run. I was getting a bit tired of the temporary swipe transition that we were using, so I put in a circular fade transition to move between scenes. You can also see here the new HUD that Dave made, which shows the time left and your progress on the level. Each enemy that you kill gets you some experience, and once you hit a certain amount, you can move on to the next level. Also, we added the timer to the game to limit the playtime, since we didn't want each run to be too long, a max of 10 minutes.
A lot of the backstory we came up with isn't explicit in the game, but it's surprising how often it helped us come up with gameplay relevant solutions during development. We'd ask, how do we justify the time limit? Oh, I know, that's the droid's battery life. It was fun tying mechanics and story together to really make this genre our own, like the idea that leveling up was actually the process of digging deeper underground, giving us a narrative reason for introducing new enemies as the player got stronger and changing the layout of the environment.
They also mocked up the UI for the unlock screen that I mentioned earlier, where you can purchase upgrades between runs, so I took some time to add that into the game. I told you, there's a lot of UI. I think the division of labor was working really well, as it felt like I could just follow along with Dave's vision for the UI, which took a big cognitive load off my shoulders, and Dave could freely design the UI without thinking too hard about how it should be implemented.
I'm gonna be honest, this was pure self-indulgence on my part. I had a ball with all the goofy sci-fi angles, cutting the corners off things for no reason, and drawing made-up retro future diskettes. And I hope the equipment icons really make you feel like you've installed some cool, futuristic hardware into your droid. Then Squid God really knocked it out of the park, bringing them to life. I'm seriously in love with the animations on this stuff.
At this point, we sort of had our core game loop strung together, so we started to do a little bit of playtesting. One thing we noticed was there wasn't much variation to the enemies, so we got started on trying to address that. I went ahead and added a different attack pattern for the fly enemy and gave it some projectiles that it could spit at the player. This made it a little bit more dynamic since you had to weave through these along with the enemies. They created some art for the larger versions of the slime, crab, and fly enemies, which turned out absolutely awesome. I especially love the fly version. In the back end, I made it so that these were a little stronger. It was around this time I finally got around to implementing what I've been putting out for a while, which was to scale the spawn rates of the enemies as you got deeper and deeper, since it was a bit strange to be fighting all these enemies while testing. The first level starts off with just a few enemies and only slime spawning, and I made it so that it ramped up level by level. While implementing that, Dave had the title screen figured out, and so we both did a little bit of work of coding and bringing it to life. They sprinkled in a little bit of lore through this sort of computer slideshow like this, along with adding a typewriter effect to display the text. They also made this amazing crank animation to remind the player to undock the crank before they started playing the game, and also came up with a name for the game, Core Fault.
I'll be honest, I'm pretty proud of the title Core Fault, and I'm shocked we couldn't find a game that had already used it. I did a bunch of sketches toying with including the alien eye or something related to the droid, but I figured the logo would probably be paired with some kind of key art of those characters, and I didn't want it to feel redundant. I finally landed on a word mark that incorporated the idea that you're drilling down into this fissure in the planet.
We did some more playtesting, and Dave pointed out a few things we should probably address. The first was that the end to each level was a bit abrupt. If you wanted to stay a bit longer, say to mine some more ore, we should give the player a pop-up and an option to move on to the next level. So they made a little pop-up UI, and I went ahead and implemented that into the game. However, I thought it was still a little too sudden, so I asked Dave to make some sort of animation for it. They went ahead and sent over this cute digging animation, and it ended up looking great in game. Another thing Dave pointed out was that the spawning behavior was a bit strange. Both the enemies and cores could spawn right in front of you, so I went ahead and made it so the levels would have a fixed amount of cores that would spawn at the start, to encourage you to move around the level. Dave also went in and made a bunch of different fixes to the code, like making the enemies spawn off screen, changing the Z indexing so if you move past different things on the screen, it would be sorted correctly, and also changing some of the equipment to make some more variation. For example, making it so the beam would fire in a clockwise pattern. It was nice working with someone that's both a programmer and an artist, so they can jump in and make some changes as well. They also pointed out that it was hard to notice that you were almost out of time, so they made some UI to have a low power warning, and I added it into the game so you would have a warning if the game was about to end. When you install a Playdate game, it comes wrapped up on device, and you can make a custom wrapping for it. And also, you can make a custom card for it as well. Dave made this glitch animated card, and also this launch animation as well, which loads directly into the title screen, along with the launch sound effect. They also ended up putting together all the sound effects and music, so I went ahead and implemented it into the game, and it really took the game to the next level.
The music was pretty straightforward synth-wavy nonsense. Lots of descending arpeggios to convey that you're digging down, a spooky minor key to keep things mysterious, and a steady beat driving things forward. For the title screen, I reused one of the chord progressions from the gameplay music, slowed it way down, added some atmospheric sounds and fake alien conversation just for fun, and jumbled together some, weird polyrhythmic stuff. I have no idea. It was kind of a rush job, but it's moody and interesting enough. I think it works. To save myself a bit of work on sound effects, I bought a gold membership on zapsplat.com, shoutouts to them, downloaded a bunch of assets that sounded cool, then sliced, combined, and warped them along with a couple custom synth effects to build out the sonic landscape of the game.
We also needed to put together the store page, and Dave had some pretty good ideas for that.
Players have a lot of options these days when browsing itch for Playdate games, so I wanted ours to stand out a little bit. Usually the cover art for these things consists of a beige 1-bit logo or screenshot, maybe with a yellow border or icon to signal it's a Playdate game, but I wanted to go for something a little different. I kind of miss the days when cover art wasn't necessarily an accurate representation of the game, but more a way to spark the player's imagination and help them project that high-fidelity idea onto the dinky little in-game sprites. Also, I felt compelled to waste time relearning Blender because I have ADHD, so I modeled the droid and the slimes and some rocks in 3D and rendered this little scene for our key art. Is your imagination sparked, or was all that time learning how to model tank treads wasted?
After that, what was left to do was a bunch of bug fixes and playtesting that ended up taking quite a while, but in the end, before I knew it, we were finished. I thought back to the start where I was under the impression that I wouldn't be able to finish something of this scope. However, after putting out several devlogs, I realized I was completely out of my depth and had to drop the project. It honestly sucked. Turns out, with a little time and help from a friend, I can do anything if I just set my mind to it. Game is now out on itch.io, and on to the next game.